Neo-existentialism: How to Conceive of the Human Mind After Naturalism's Failure, from Markus-Gabriel, 2018. It is a widespread assumption in contemporary scientific culture that the existence of mental objects rests on very shaky ground. By contrast, physical objects are supposed to exist beyond any reasonable doubt. Let us call this the post-Cartesian ontological asymmetry. Whereas Descartes, like many of his predecessors, unabashedly argued for the inverse asymmetry, claiming not only that the mind is better known to the mind than any other object, but that it also enjoys a privileged mode of existence, being closer in ontological kind to God than to material substance, the order of the ontological universe has subsequently been reversed. Be that as it may, what would entitle us to continue to believe in ontological asymmetry? Are there any deeper reasons to privilege either physical or mental objects in the best account of what there is? Very roughly, in our scientific age, one might begin to give voice to one's post-Cartesian preferences by pointing out that while there evidently are rocks, bacteria, paramecia and fingernails, Faust, Macbeth and the Fountain of Youth clearly do not exist, regardless of the fact that there are various discursive practices, language games, which entitle us to engage in a game of make-believe involving talk about these kinds of things. These kinds of things are typically called fictional, where this means that they are individuals first introduced in a work of fiction. They depend for their existence on minds in a way in which rocks do not. It borders on triviality that Macbeth would not have existed had there been no minds, and those who hold the view known as fictional irrealism deny that he exists at all, sometimes on the ground that had he existed, he would have been a mere figment of imagination, and in that sense nothing that could count as actually existing. In this context, it is tempting to group the mind itself with fictional objects, to the extent to which one's reasons to grant the latter a reduced ontological status, if any, are tantamount to one's reasons for denying them mind independence. If the mind were mind-dependent in the same way as the Fountain of Youth, in an ontological framework privileging mind independence in our account of what there is, we would have reasons to downgrade the mind as a whole. Arguably, at this point, a typical representative of contemporary scientific culture will argue that the mind is not mind-dependent in the same way in which the Fountain of Youth is, as the mind can ultimately be identified with a physical object, the brain. Despite the complexities of figuring out how exactly to make sense of such an identity claim, given, among other things, the apparent epistemological asymmetry of mind and brain, the stereotypical modern scientist will hope that the impression that there is a real distinction at the level of the apparent epistemological asymmetry sooner or later goes away, as science makes progress with respect to the mind. The better we actually know the brain, the safer it will seem to identify mind and brain and to undermine our Cartesian intuitions, our impression that the mind substantially differs from the brain. In what follows, I will put pressure on the entire framework which gives rise to this branch of the modern scientific worldview. In particular, I will sketch a position I dub neo-existentialism. Neo-existentialism is the view that there is no single phenomenon or reality corresponding to the ultimately very messy umbrella term, the mind. Rather, the phenomena typically grouped together under this heading are located on a spectrum, ranging from the obviously physical to the non-existing. However, what unifies the various phenomena subsumed under the messy concept of the mind, after all, is that they all are consequences of the attempt of the human being to distinguish itself both from the purely physical universe and from the rest of the animal kingdom. In so doing, our self-portrait as specifically minded creatures evolved in light of our equally varying accounts of what it is for non-human beings to exist. The fundamental tenet of neo-existentialism is that there is no single entity in the world picked out by our diachronically and synchronically differentiated mentalistic vocabulary. Ooh. The fundamental tenet of neo-existentialism is that there is no single entity in the world picked out by our diachronically and synchronically differentiated mentalistic vocabulary. Nothing which is conscious, self-conscious, aware of itself, neurotic, a processor of qualitative states, vigilant, intelligent, etc. What unifies our mentalistic vocabulary is the capacity to produce further items on the list of accounts of what it is, not merely to blend in with a world replete with inanimate objects governed by physical laws of nature, on the one hand, and animals driven by biological parameters on the other. Our self-portrait as minded is in place in order to help us make sense of the fact that we do not belong to the domain of what merely exists in an anonymous manner, as it were. We are neither exactly like rocks, nor exactly like a beetle lying on a rock. Our conception of ourselves as minded was forged over millennia of history, in which it was taken for granted that whatever distinguishes us from the remainder of what there is, it can only be accounted for in mentalistic terms. This structure is the breeding ground of the very notion of human being, the notion without which we would be in no position to wonder what the relation between mind and non-mental nature could possibly be. Over the course of known documented history, humanity has developed highly nuanced accounts of what distinguishes us from inanimate and animal nature. In my view, this is the real source behind what Hugh Price has aptly called the placement issue. To put this problem as bluntly as possible, it arises from wondering how the mind, that is, the manifold objects, if any, picked out by our mentalistic vocabulary, fits into the purely natural order. My own term for the purely natural order is the universe. I distinguish between the universe and the world. Whereas the former refers to the domain of objects studied by our best natural sciences, maybe ideally by futuristic unified physics, or depending on the status of the unity-disunity of science, by any relevant ensemble of established present and future disciplines. The latter is the hypothetical all-encompassing domain of objects. For reasons spelled out elsewhere, I believe that this idea of the world should be reformulated. We should understand the world neither as an all-encompassing domain of objects, nor as the all-encompassing domain of facts, but as what I call the field of sense of all fields of sense. Here, a field of sense, or FOS, is my name for a domain of objects individuated by what corresponds to the right way of thinking about its objects. The right way of thinking about the objects in a given domain is the way which lets us grasp them as they are under the descriptions which aptly characterize them as being whatever they are. The universe is an FOS within a domain encompassing further FOSs. It is nested within an open system of FOSs. There is no overall, all-encompassing FOS. I call this result from the ontology of FOSs the no-world view, and I summarize it in the expression that the world does not exist. According to neo-existentialism, the mind belongs neither to the natural order, the universe, nor to the world. However, it exists in a whole series of FOSs in such a way that the various phenomena grouped together under the umbrella term the mind do not pick out a clearly delineated object or range of objects. Nevertheless, there is an invariant unifying structure which holds our mentalistic vocabulary together. This structure is what I call Geist. Given that Geist is a technical notion here designed to account for the invariant in the background of the messy variations of mentalistic vocabulary, it is guaranteed to be less messy than the series of mentalistic vocabularies we happen to find. Notice that according to my proposal, some parts or subdomains of Geist are included in the universe. All that I will be arguing for is that neither all parts nor the whole of Geist can exist in the universe. If the mind, as the fusion of various objects brought into existence by Geist's historically shifting attempts to make sense of the distinction between human and non-human being exists at all, according to my background ontology, it has to fit into some FOS or other. Even if the mind is a fictional object, or a nest of fictional objects, it will find its place in a suitable FOS distinguished from other FOSs. This will be true both horizontally, in comparison with other, say, literary or cinematic fictions, and vertically, in the context of FOSs belonging to an entirely different, specifically non-fictional category, such as the FOS of astrophysics. The right kind of ontological pluralism that allows for a plurality of domains related to each other in a larger order, composed of different categorically distinct pockets, easily accommodates the mind, whatever its nature turns out to be. Ontological pluralism trivially leaves room for the mind, as many of the items picked out by various mentalistic vocabularies, consciousness, awareness, emotions, being awake, etc., can be accommodated without having to place them in the same ontological realm, the same FOS, as baryonic matter, galaxies, or the cerebellum, say. It is harder for the metaphysical monist to do justice to the respectable trains of thought that amount to a placement problem. In order to see why, imagine two extreme views, brute materialism and brute idealism. Brute materialism claims that the only thing there is the universe, and that the universe is identical with material energetic reality. Brute idealism is the most radical denial of this monism, as it maintains that all there is mental, that is, either some mental content or a mind, where mind and the mental are categorically juxtaposed to the material energetic. Brute idealism denies the existence of non-mental objects. On both extremes of metaphysical monism, in principle, no placement problem arises. Brute materialism has no room for a conception of the mind that would lead to a puzzle about its place in nature, identified with the universe in the sense of the entirety of the material energetic. And brute idealism, in turn, has no room for a conception of a nature that would motivate a puzzle about its relation to the mind. Despite the fact that there is a massive return of grand metaphysics in both the so-called analytic and the so-called continental traditions of philosophy, the issues discussed in the philosophy of mind call for independent conceptual treatment. The main reason for this can already be guessed from the broad strokes of my introductory remarks. If the placement problem were merely a metaphysical issue that needs to go away, we could easily circumvent it in indefinitely many ways by working out a metaphysical system close enough either to metaphysical pluralism or to metaphysical monism. All we would need to avoid is the obviously untenable position of metaphysical dualism in the sense of a view that subscribes both to the unity of reality and to its having two big chunks, matter and mind, separated by some kind of gulf. Notoriously, even Descartes, who is usually invoked as a prime representative of the shortcomings of metaphysical dualism, admits that there is a problem here. He oscillates between an actual metaphysical dualism, belief in two substances, that is, two categorically distinct kinds of things, and metaphysical monism, as he sometimes writes that, strictly speaking, only God is a substance. If there is only one reality, it is indeed puzzling what one could mean by the assertion that there are two kinds of things within that reality, matter and mind. What is the nature of that reality which accounts for the emergence of an extraordinary duality within itself? So-called neutral monism, which is the view or family of views that there is a third kind of thing underlying the differentiation into the two kinds of things earlier identified, owes us an account of the nature of the extraordinary third kind of thing which avoids unwelcome regresses or unwarranted blockers thereof. In what follows, I will argue that the widespread use of the term naturalism has proven to be a mere fig leaf to cover up the embarrassing lack of a suitable metaphysical account which both preserves the existence of the mind and raises the problem of its integration into a wider domain, containing not only minds and their contents, but events such as the Big Bang, the inflation of the universe, digestion, and objects such as fingernails, gauge bosons, and so forth. Gauge bosons, and so forth. Naturalism is at best a mongrel term mingling together various philosophical commitments designed to avoid addressing the underlying metaphysical and epistemological issues head on. Naturalism, in my view, basically boils down to an avoidance strategy. The reason for its existence and widespread acceptance among philosophers and scientists alike in many parts of the world is ideological. Roughly speaking, by an ideology here, I am referring to any attempt to present something that is an historically contingent representation of the human mind, a case of Geist, as a natural fact of the matter about us humans. That naturalism can be seen as an ideology has aptly, albeit overly polemically, been remarked on by the late Hilary Putnam in his Philosophy in an Age of Science. Open quote. Today, the most common use of the term naturalism might be described as follows. Philosophers, perhaps even a majority of all the philosophers writing about issues in metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language, announce in one or another conspicuous place in their essays and books that they are naturalists, or that the view or account being defended is a naturalist one. This announcement, in its placing and emphasis, resembles the placing of the announcement in articles written in Stalin's Soviet Union that a view was in agreement with Comrade Stalin's. As in the case of the latter announcement, it is supposed to be clear that any view that is not naturalist, not in agreement with Comrade Stalin's view, is anathema and could not possibly be correct. A further very common feature is that, as a rule, naturalism is not defined. End of quote. That's from 2012. The comparison with Stalinism suggests a political background to the ideology of naturalism. With a pinch of salt and some irony, one could indeed make a case for the diagnosis that naturalism is Soviet historico-dialectical materialism without Soviets' history and dialectics. It is a watered-down version of good old materialism. In this vein, it can be seen as an odd remainder of earlier stages of the Cold War, a simplified materialist ideology originally promoted by US-American ideological state apparatuses, including universities, in order to combat Soviet ideas. It would take at least a book-length discussion of the relation of the notion of ideology explicitly deployed here to the wider notion of political ideology to actually establish the details of such a sweeping claim. Suffice it to remind us of the fact that Marx and Engels, back in their day, introduced their brand of historical dialectical materialism with the human being at its centre in order to combat the simplified materialist ideology which emerged together with positivism in their half of the 19th century. Be that as it may, what is certainly correct in Putnam's diagnosis is that continued adherence to naturalism, whether on the level of scientific methodology or of substantial metaphysical commitment, is not simply a consequence of natural science. Generally, no overall worldview is recommended by any specific insight into the structure of the universe, understood as the domain under investigation by the natural sciences. One of the reasons for this is that in order to arrive at any sufficient worldview with ambitions to completeness, we would have to give an account of which elements of human language and thought actually refer to something real. And no such account can easily be given without a good deal of philosophical work, which divides fragments of human language and thought into different categories, such as the categories of referring and non-referring inferential vocabulary, say, which elements of thought latch onto an independent reality, a reality not consisting in binding thoughts internally together, cannot be settled by inspecting the universe. This should be evident as long as we stick to the meaning of the universe as the domain of objects under investigation in the natural sciences, and as long as logic is not included in the catalogue of our natural sciences. If it were, and if it therefore had a suitable domain of objects, naturalism would be false anyway, as independent reality would then encompass norms for thought as such, an ontological commitment unlikely to lend support to naturalism. Consciousness of the gap. Contemporary scientists and philosophers alike regularly avow that the problem of consciousness is one of the last riddles we need to solve in order to finally sail into the safe haven of a fully naturalistic worldview. Here are two examples. First, the somewhat ironic opening line of Daniel Dennett's influential book, Consciousness Explained. Quote, "Human consciousness is just about the last surviving mystery. A mystery is a phenomenon that people don't know how to think about yet." End of quote. Second, David Chalmers opens his equally influential The Conscious Mind with a similar, albeit far from ironic, confession. Open quote. "Consciousness is the biggest mystery. It may be the largest outstanding obstacle in our quest for a scientific understanding of the universe. Present-day scientific theories hardly touch the really difficult questions about consciousness. We do not just lack a detailed theory, we are entirely in the dark about how consciousness fits into the natural order." End of quote. Minimally, the naturalistic worldview assumes that we ought to fit all phenomena into the natural order. Everything which dangles free from the natural order either does not really exist or is a surprising epiphenomenon and is in any event nothing which could interfere with the real. To claim that consciousness or the mind are mysteries or riddles is to claim that it is hard or maybe even impossible to figure out how consciousness or the mind can be part of nature in a scientifically respectable sense of nature. Here, the metaphysical assumption without which the mystery could not get off the ground is that the natural order cannot be maximal in the sense of including all phenomena. For, if the natural order was simply everything there is, it would be easy to see how consciousness fits into the natural order. Naturalism had better not assume from the outset that consciousness does not exist, or that no term in our mentalistic vocabulary is in the business of referring to something real, in order for there to be a mystery of any kind, the natural order has to be thought of in such a way that consciousness is not immediately accessible from within the natural order as we know it to be. That is to say, the naturalist has to restrict the meaning of the natural order in such a way that there is room for puzzlement concerning some phenomena which suggest the existence of some kind of things without their yet being integrated into what we know about the natural order. This excludes ectoplasm, phlogiston, witches and the like, but does not yet exclude consciousness in general. Nevertheless, for consciousness to be a puzzle is for it to be on the verge of extinction. Whatever is not yet clearly included in the domain of the natural order as construed by the naturalist is essentially suspicious. The naturalistic worldview is supposed to be a safe haven because of its apparent methodological superiority over its actual and imaginary rivals. The historical background idea, which lends genealogical and psychological support to this confidence, is the notion that modernity is clearly an overall cultural progress accompanied, if not actually triggered by, an early modern scientific revolution stereotypically associated with Galileo and Newton. They are seen as decisive, revolutionary cuts in the history of human thought because their discoveries reveal a gap hitherto largely covered up by an ancient Aristotelian conception of science and nature. The gap consists in a thorough distinction between how things appear to us as human observers of nature and nature itself. As human observers, we are prone to believe that physical objects have smoothly coloured surfaces, regardless of how they appear to us. We believe in dusk and dawn, and in heaven, understood as a luminous sphere through which we can see the movement of astronomical phenomena. A sphere, blue or grey during daytime, depending on whether you live in Greece or Germany, and mostly black or grey, again depending on location and season, at night, etc. Even Kant, in his famous remark that what awes him most is the starry sky above me and the moral law in me, is in the grip of a pre-modern illusion, the illusion that the starry sky is above him. Even if there were a starry sky, it would be not above him, but all around him. Yet this would make it look less transcendent, as we tend to point upwards when it comes to mysterious or awe-provoking matters, which is just a bad habit inherited from our less enlightened ancestors. Wilfrid Sellars has notoriously named the two sides of the gap, the manifest image and the scientific image of man, respectively. Notice that Sellars does not speak of the manifest and the scientific image tout court, as he wants to emphasize that both images are systematic overall representations of how things hang together in the broadest possible sense, from the standpoint of a human being. There are, of course, various other ways of labelling and characterizing the gap in question. Subjective versus objective, first person versus third person perspective, thick versus thin concepts, life world and science, etc. For brevity's sake, let us just speak of the gap in order to avoid hasty conceptualizations of the phenomena in question. Most accounts of the gap draw on a genealogical story in order to account for the alleged fact that only modern people become fully aware of it. We moderns are proud discoverers of the gap, and we shun anybody who does not share our sense of it. On account of the genealogical myths which surround our modern encounter with the gap, the details of the actual story make it hard to see the conceptual core, which will play a central role in due course. Arguably, all accounts of the gap rely on a background picture, which I call standard naturalism. Standard naturalism is really a fusion of a number of claims, in particular a metaphysical claim, an epistemological claim, and two continuity theses. 1. SN1. Metaphysical naturalism, materialism. Everything which really exists is ultimately material energetic and therefore woven into the causal web studied by our best natural scientific practices. 2. Standard Naturalism 2. Epistemological naturalism. Everything which really exists can best be explained with recourse to the standards of theory construction definitive of our best natural scientific practices. SN3. Biological continuity. The human brain, the human mind, is part of the natural order. It is a natural kind located on a specific branch of evolution. And SN4. Methodological continuity. Every genuine explanation has always been governed by the standards made explicit by modern science. There are other ways of classifying the tenets built into the rather vague structure of the modern scientific worldview. In what follows, I will mostly argue against SN1, which was metaphysical naturalism, and SN3, which was biological continuity. Yet, I believe that naturalism fails on all fronts. The human mind is not a natural kind. Only a proper subset of our mentalistic vocabulary picks out natural kinds, even though it is the case that no part of that vocabulary refers to a reality that would have existed had there been no suitable brains or other natural necessary conditions for there to be mental processes in reality. Nevertheless, let me emphasize before I get to work that naturalism is based on a wide array of actual facts that need to be respected and typically have been respected all along by many critics of naturalism. To start with, I do not intend to deny that humans are animals, and therefore, in part, objects governed by the parameters articulated by evolutionary theory. Neither do I want to deny that Aristotelian physics turned out to be a huge failure. When it comes to the human mind, I am a biological naturalist in the sense of someone who holds that a certain type of brain is a natural necessary condition for human-mindedness, albeit not a sufficient one. I am not interested in undermining scientifically established facts, but I am in the business of attacking philosophically misguided interpretations of what natural science has established and can establish in the future with respect to the human mind. Philosophically misguided interpretations of natural science are widespread, both among philosophers and among scientists. In the next part of this chapter, I will sketch some recent arguments against naturalism, in particular against SN1, metaphysical naturalism, and SN3, biological continuity. I will then address the pressing question of how to conceive of the human mind after the failures of naturalism. If naturalism does not work, we need an alternative, unless we are happy to accept an irresoluble riddle, a view which also has some prominent defenders. Naturalism's failures. Let us begin the work of questioning naturalism's claim to legitimacy with a very natural thought experiment, which I will call the New Yorker, based on the cover of the magazine's issue for March 29, 1976, also known as View of the World from 9th Avenue. As I write these lines, I am in Paris, which serves just as well for the thought experiment as New York. Paris is located in France. France is located on the face of the Earth, which is one of the planets orbiting the Sun. When I assert these trivialities, I imagine a position from which I am able to assess these claims about our location in the universe, such as Google Earth. If I press the minus button on Google Earth long enough, I get to see the Earth. There is a vantage point from which the Earth can be observed. At this point, let us invent a much more powerful engine, Google Universe. If I press minus in Google Universe, I am in a position to observe the Earth, our solar system, its location in a branch of the Milky Way, the galaxy cluster of which the Milky Way is a part, and eventually the entire universe. But stop! Which position do I occupy when I finally reach the position from which I can assess claims about the structure of the entire universe? Certainly I cannot coherently imagine a position from which I can observe the entire universe in a way strictly analogous to any position conceivable in a Google Earth format. The standpoint from which I observe the Earth, where I am actually located while using Google Earth, has a physical location at a certain distance from Earth. Yet the standpoint from which I observe the entire universe within which I am located cannot have a physical location at a certain distance from the universe, since any such location would be within the universe. It is part and parcel of the standpoint of Google Earth that its standpoint is not on Earth, but it does not make sense to introduce a standpoint that is not in the universe, since it is part of the concept of a standpoint that we can account for its features in terms of basic geometrical and more complicated physical features built into the optical or observer relative conditions for standpoints. What we know about standpoints is incompatible with the notion that we could conceive of a standpoint outside of the universe from which we could literally observe it. Against this background, philosophers have criticized the assumptions underpinning the illusion of the possibility of Google Universe, which overextends the notion of a standpoint or point of view. For instance, Hilary Putnam attacks this as a God's eye view. Thomas Nagel has labelled this a view from nowhere. And Willard Van Orman Quine denies us access to any such cosmic exile. However, metaphysical naturalism or materialism seems to rely on the availability, conceivability, of a view from nowhere, as it makes claims about absolutely everything without being in a position to make justified claims about its own position within the physical totality, which is its object. At this point, the would-be materialist might resort to one of the following two options. 1. Argue that Google Universe is conceivable and possible after all. 2. Argue that materialism is not based on such an incoherent scenario. Arguments for Google Universe might set out from the observation that the standpoint envisaged by Google Universe simply is our standpoint. We learn from the standpoint of Google Universe that we have a location in space-time as a whole, which can be described in terms of physics. We could apply this to Google Earth as well. If we see Earth in Google Earth, we see where we are located. If we see ourselves in the universe as a whole, we do so from within the universe. But this does not solve the problem that there is literally a standpoint from which we can see Earth and realise that we are located on Earth, whereas there is no such standpoint for the universe, at least not for the materialist. Thus, this option is ultimately hopeless and unnecessarily reactive. This is why the materialist had better choose to argue that materialism is not based on an incoherent thought experiment. At this point, she might reply that materialism is a well-established theory based on insights into the overall causal or nomological closure of the universe. The universe is supposed to be governed by natural laws and to harbour physical objects, which are defined as material energetic objects or structures and are all parts of a whole, the universe, nature, or the cosmos. Still, even on this level, materialism is a metaphysical position in at least 3 senses of the term metaphysics. First, it is a theory which claims that absolutely everything shares a set of features. Absolutely everything which really exists is supposed to be material, energetic, and governed by the laws of nature. Metaphysics is the discipline that deals with absolutely everything. It is the most universal investigation into the nature of reality, its composition, and architecture. The claim that metaphysics is ultimately futuristic, unified physics can be called physicalism, or rather metaphysicalism, as it is based on a metaphysical interpretation of the nature of physics rather than on physics as it happens to be. Second, materialism is not an empirical claim. Empirical claims are claims about the composition of specific regions of the universe. We often generalize inductively or in some other legitimate way on the basis of given data, but it is the nature of data, that is information, that it is always limited. Here is a simple illustration of the contrast between metaphysical and empirical that I have in mind. It is an empirical fact that there are both bosons and fermions. We managed to discover this in a certain way, and we have good reasons to ascribe different properties to these particles, which is why we believe they are different. Knowing something about bosons means acquiring information, which puts us in a position to distinguish one kind of physical object from another kind of physical object. This is empirical knowledge based on information that we use in order to build a theory, which allows us to understand the basic structure of some phenomenon or another. In contrast to this, empirical knowledge, to know that all physical objects are objects, or to know that every physical object is identical with itself and differs from other objects, is categorically distinct and relegates us to a different level of generality. It is hard to see what it would mean to refrain from such a knowledge claim, or to base it on privileged cases, or any case at all. It carries almost no information, and certainly on this level of abstraction, carries no information that helps us to distinguish some natural object from any other natural object. Materialism makes claims about all objects. In this respect, it cannot tell us anything about those objects, except that they differ from other kinds of object, which, according to materialism, do not exist. The objects whose existence materialism rules out are the immaterial objects. Material objects do not differ from immaterial objects because they have different properties. The point of materialism is a denial of the very existence of immaterial objects. If they do not even exist, they cannot have any properties by which they can be distinguished from material objects. The materialist is not an open-minded researcher who is willing to countenance the existence of immaterial objects if someone can point them out to her, for it is extremely straightforward to do this without changing the materialist's mind. There are numbers, republics, fictional characters populating novels, movies and dreams, colour sensations and beliefs, none of which are evidently material, energetic, physical objects. The materialist is not moved by my insistence that there are these objects, but will immediately look out for a theory construction that allows her to eliminate these objects from a scientifically minded worldview by claiming that they have a hidden material nature. From this theoretical attitude alone, you can immediately tell that materialism is a metaphysical and not an empirical view based on actual scientific discoveries. It is, in principle, impossible to empirically discover the alleged facts that materialism is true, as no actual empirical discovery rules out the existence of immaterial objects. Third, materialism is also a metaphysical thesis in that it claims to explain reality as it would have been had no one ever noticed that it is a certain way. Materialism is supposed to be a strictly theory-independent fact, that is, a fact we discover, but not one we produce by having a belief to the effect that it is true. We do not make materialism true by believing that everything is material, It is supposed to be an insight into the nature of reality, one with the somewhat special status of both drawing on actual scientific knowledge and going beyond anything that could be either empirically tested or refuted. Let me give you a straightforward example of the tensions this creates. Daniel Dennett, who leaves no room for doubt about his materialist credence, claims early on in his Consciousness Explained, quote, "In short, the mind is the brain. According to the materialists, we can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth." End of quote. Now, notice the suspicious exclamation mark in the quote, which at first glance seems to be an avowal of modesty. Yet it really amounts to the stance Karl Popper labelled promissory materialism, as the possibility of accounting for mental phenomena from a materialist standpoint is as yet far from realised. Remarkably, less than 30 pages before this quote, in the opening argument of the entire game, Dennett argues against the anti-materialist strands of philosophy of mind on the basis of a rejection of possibilities in principle. Open quote. "One should be leery of these possibilities in principle. It is also possible in principle to build a stainless steel ladder to the moon and to write out in alphabetical order all intelligible in English conversations consisting of less than 1,000 words. But neither of these are remotely possible in fact, and sometimes an impossibility in fact is theoretically more interesting than a possibility in principle." End of quote. I concur. However, the lesson to draw from this is that it is impossible, in fact, to establish the truth of materialism on the basis of what we actually know from the natural sciences. What is worse for Dennett is that within 30 pages we witness a straightforward methodological contradiction. On the one hand, our construction of a theory of consciousness is supposed to rely on an empirical spirit as opposed to these possibilities in principle, while, on the other, that empirical stance itself is only delineated in virtue of a possibility in principle. So far, I have argued that metaphysical naturalism, that is, materialism, fails because it is a methodological mixture of metaphysics and empirical research. It is simply a largely unwarranted pseudo-inductive overgeneralization. There is a second set of prominent anti-materialist arguments in contemporary philosophy. Arguments in this second set derive from the exciting interface of philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. Standard philosophy of mind deals with the mind-brain problem. That is, with the problem that it is very hard to see how mental items could be related to physical items and processes that fit into the natural order, such as the biochemical processes that take place within certain regions inside our skulls. Yet one might wonder how we can actually flesh out what is so worrisome about the mind-brain problem, if there actually really is such a problem. One overall answer to this question draws on the conceptual machinery of the philosophical theory of meaning, more specifically on truth-conditional semantics. Roughly, truth-conditional semantics studies the relation between fragments of language and what they are about, between world and world, to put it in words of one syllable. In this context, one can approach the mind-brain problem via the following basic reconstruction of the conceptual machinery that creates the air of paradox constitutive of the mind-brain problem. In his sophisticated book, Purple Haze, Joseph Levine distinguishes two kinds of ways in which singular terms such as nouns or descriptive phrases like the most expensive ring in this room can be seen to refer to the objects they pick out. One way might be called mere labelling. Mere labelling puts a speaker in semantic contact with some object or stuff in her environment with which she is already in casual contact, in such a way that she puts a random label on the object or stuff without associating any explicitly available feature with the object itself. The object is thinly presented to her, as Levine puts it. That is, she might have all sorts of ideas about the object in question, while at the same time she is immediately in a position to grant that her ideas might be largely wide of the mark. For instance, my use of boson and fermion in an earlier paragraph of this chapter is fairly thin, as I am by no means a trained atomic physicist. If someone who is more of an expert on particles were to tell me that I've got even the basics wrong in my token use of the scientific terms, I would be happy to concede this and to revise my notions so that the result might be a more watertight use of the relevant terms. Another standard, albeit ultimately misguided example among philosophers is the identity of water and H2o, about which no ancient philosopher had any idea. Yet this does not mean that Thales, Plato, or Karl Marx, for that matter, were not able to correctly use the words Greek and German for water, respectively. Water is just a mere label we apply to watery stuff, regardless of our knowledge or ignorance of its molecular composition. The nature of water is not necessarily manifest in any competent referential use of water terms. Levine contrasts the labelling case with the case of thick, phenomenal, or substantive concepts, as he calls them respectively. That something looks reddish to me in a certain way might also be expressed by uttering the words, "This red is beautiful," or "This red is closer to purple than that other red." What we judge when we claim that assertions of this type are apt to be true cannot be judged by replacing the term with its thin counterpart. Open quote. This energetic structure with a wavelength of roughly 650 nm is beautiful, close quote, presents the object in a way that just does not lend itself to the judgment of beauty associated with the phenomenal experience of reddishness. On closer inspection, the distinction between a thick and a thin concept does not help our case against the materialist, for there are various materialist strategies of levelling the contrast between thick and thin referential usages of singular terms. For one thing, the contrast between water and H2O that explains why we can learn something by figuring out that water is H2O also relies on a thick phenomenal concept of water as watery stuff, thirst-quenching bottled water, relaxing bath water, salty sea water, which reminds us of our first teenage love, or whatever. We might at first be surprised to learn that water evaporates, congeals and boils because of its molecular features when we find a hidden unity among the various surface qualities of water. But in any event, there will be a phenomenal concept of water so that neither water nor red are mere labels. Given that we can perform materialist explanations in the thick water case, as Levine himself concedes, this undermines his case for red. If there are thin and thick usages of any term, pointing out that there is a thin usage in a given case, such as red, does not help against the materialist. At best, it amounts to a version of Jackson's knowledge argument and lands us in a different dialectics. Be that as it may, Levine is after something worth keeping in mind for the constructive story to be told in the second half of this chapter. He offers a subtle semantic version of the gap, one which potentially does not motivate a placement issue per se. David Chalmers argues prominently against materialism on a slightly different but relevantly similar semantic basis, which accounts for the apparent distinction between the water case and the red case in different terms. Chalmers unequivocally argues, open quote, that materialism is false and that a form of dualism is true, end of quote. He defines materialism as, open quote, the widely held doctrine which is generally taken to hold that everything in the world is physical, or that there is nothing over and above the physical, or that the physical facts in a certain sense exhaust all the facts about the world, end of quote. His much discussed conceivability argument against materialism can be reconstructed in the following simplified manner. First, we need the notion of a philosophical zombie, a physical replica of an actual human being without any inner mental life. A philosophical zombie will look just like me on the outside and on the inside, but no one will be at home, as it were. In order to make the option of philosophical zombies look slightly more plausible, imagine a scenario, a possible world, in which there is a planet on which matter regularly happens to be arranged in such a way that human observers would believe they were witnessing real human patterns there. But all there is are very stable arrangements of matter which under any possible scrutiny are indistinguishable by anyone from human beings. Notice that Chalmers does not claim that zombies are possible in our actual world. In our world, he believes, everything which would be a physical replica of me, that is, an exact copy located in a different position from where I stand right now, would, of course, be conscious and probably in some sense have largely the same experience as I do. This is why the conceivability argument is both weaker and stronger than it appears at first glance. It is weaker in that it does not establish non-materialism for our world, and stronger in that it shows that the identity of mind and matter can never be established in principle. Open quote, in our language, materialism is true if all the positive facts about the world are globally, logically supervenient on the physical facts. This captures the intuitive notion that if materialism is true, then once God fixed the physical facts about the world, all the facts were fixed. End of quote. That's from Chalmers, 1996. Here is a sketch of the argument which merely serves to illustrate the basic ideas and is not intended to be the most compelling version. Point 1. Zombies are conceivable. The concept of a zombie does not harbour any logical contradiction. 2. If zombies are conceivable, they are possible. There is a possible world where everybody is a zombie equals a zombie world. 3. If brain and mind are identical, the brain-mind link is metaphysically necessary, given the metaphysical necessity of identity. 4. If the brain-mind link is metaphysically necessary, there is no zombie world. 5. If materialism is true, the brain-mind link is metaphysically necessary. 6. There is a zombie world. 7. The brain-mind link is not metaphysically necessary. Therefore, materialism is false. What is more interesting from a philosophical point of view than the actual argument, which in my view, as will come out later, is flawed beyond repair, is the technical backstage machinery called two-dimensional semantics. Here again, the idea is quite simple and easy to follow. There are two senses in which we use the term water. In one sense, which Chalmers calls the primary intention, that is the primary sense, water means watery stuff. Thales and Plato knew what they were talking about when they used Greek representation of water, even though they had false beliefs about its molecular composition, if any. If water had turned out to have a different molecular composition, say XYZ, as philosophers usually put it, Thales and Plato could still have insisted that they knew the meaning of Greek word for water. The second sense of water is its secondary intention. The second sense of water, its secondary intention, is a function from linguistic meaning to the actual referent. The term water actually picks out stuff that contains H2O molecules, and in this second sense it is necessary that it do so. Here is a simple reason for all this. All identities are necessary. The fact that I am I, or that mains is necessary if anything is. If mains exists, it will be mains, no surprise. Boys will be boys. If water is identical to H2O, it could not have been otherwise. What this means on Chalmers' semantic construal is that we evaluate uses of water in two dimensions. In one dimension, where we know what we mean regardless of what the natural facts turn out to be, facts which are involved in the referential bit of our speech patterns, and in another where we take into account that water actually refers to a certain stuff with a given molecular composition. What water actually refers to simply could not have been otherwise than a way it turns out to be. Given that this is a semantic model and not a linguistic claim about the actual use of water terms in various languages, dialects or idiolects, all that we need is the prima facie stability of the model. It is not obviously incoherent, and Chalmers and others have defended it with respectable technical precision and detail. So far, so good then. Chalmers now points out that, in the case of our mental vocabulary, the vocabulary in which our self-descriptions as mentally endowed conscious subjects are couched, the primary and the secondary intentions cannot come radically apart. Take as an example my impression that it feels comfortably warm in this room as I am writing this sentence. This feeling is causally hooked up with a very complex network of physical properties, ranging from kinetic energy to a complicated structure of information processing triggered in my organism as a result of its surface exposure to its natural environment. Yet it seems extremely odd to entertain the thought that the feeling of being warm could literally be an aggregate state of a natural kind which has the state of being angry at the fact that Trump won the American election as one of its parts. It looks as if we could rule this out, regardless of further empirical inquiry. There seems to be no room for this option. Temperature does not suddenly change into anger, so that we need an account of this process. By contrast, we know that many natural phenomena, such as the phenomena earlier called electricity and magnetism, hang together and are manifestations of a single phenomenon, which is only revealed once we fix the actual reference, the secondary intentions, of our earlier uninformed electricity talk. Our phenomenal experience cannot always, or in principle, differ radically from how things are on the level of their neural support in such a way that we could find, from the third-person perspective, that we are in a phenomenal state that is entirely different from what the subject is capable of reporting. Chalmers thinks that his two-dimensional semantics is capable of supporting his version of the age-old Cartesian intuition that we have a privileged access to our own minds. Open quote. We know consciousness far more intimately than we know the rest of the world, but we understand the rest of the world far better than we understand consciousness. End of quote. However, what seems really to be the case here is the reverse. If two-dimensional semantics demonstrates that there is something like a thick use of phenomenal concepts, it thereby proves that we both know and fully understand consciousness a priori in the relevant dimension. Therefore, there neither is a mystery nor a great riddle nor a hard problem. We just know consciousness from within, and we fully understand it, at least on the level of our competent usage of mentalistic vocabulary along one of the two semantic axes. Given that the two cannot radically come apart according to the application of two-dimensional semantics to the brain-mind problem, there does not seem to be a further issue here. There is a lot of wiggle room for the materialist to challenge the notion that there really is a semantic gap between two ways in which singular terms refer, such that this gap would lend support to anti-materialistic conclusions about our mentalistic vocabulary. Like Levine, Chalmers provides detailed and interesting, technically sophisticated responses to some of the manoeuvres that come to mind here. Be that as it may, and setting some details aside, I agree with the upshot of Levine's, Chalmers, and many others' basic idea that there is something special about our mental vocabulary, an idea that harks back at least as far as to Plato. However, I entirely disagree with their way of locating the semantic gap within the natural order. What characteristically happens when we try to force the conscious mind with its semantic peculiarities into the natural order can be seen in roughly the last 100 pages of Chalmers' famous book. Chalmers argues both for the irreducibility of the conscious mind to a non-conscious material fundamental level and for its integration into the natural order. According to this strategy, he needs to make room in the natural order for the conscious mind that ex hypothesi does not fit into the natural order if the natural order is exactly like the materialist wants to describe it. Hence, Chalmers resorts to the strategy of wonder tissue, as Dennett has polemically coined moves of this sort. Like so many others over the last 100 years before him, Chalmers invokes the various interpretations of quantum mechanics as a source for possible radical revisions of our notion of the material energetic realm, in order to have space for new kinds of material entities or laws, which might then include natural laws governing additional conscious or proto-conscious wonder tissue. Let me call strategies which invoke new, hitherto scientifically undisclosed features of the universe in order to solve the placement problem of the mind, speculative metaphysics. The most prominent historical representative of this strategy is Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, who actually inspired medical science and neurobiology and was scientifically up to date in his time. Schelling also founded the Journal of Speculative Physics, which published articles arguably designed to widen our notion of nature so as to have room for the conscious mind and its prehistorical evolutionary stages. In his most recent book, Mind and Cosmos, Thomas Nagel explicitly affiliates himself with Plato, Schelling, and Hegel, and proposes a simplified version of their overall teleological account of mind's position in the cosmos. Nagel indeed shares a starting point with the objective idealists, for he claims that science is bound to commit some version of an idealist principle of intelligibility. The idealist principle of intelligibility generally holds that reality has to be intelligible to such an extent that we can rule out a priori that any far-fetched hypothesis holds which makes reality in principle inaccessible to human inquisitiveness. The theory of evolution and its actual application in various subfields of biology assumes that its explanatory model resonates with the reality it attempts to explain. It rules out a priori, that is, without any application of its model to an empirically given item or structure, that nature did not come into existence 5 minutes ago with the traces of a far-reaching past, and that for similar reasons, young Earth creationism or any other skeptical hypothesis can be discounted in actual scientific practice. Evolutionary theory, like any theory with obvious objective purport, relies on a match between thought and reality that guarantees there is nothing intrinsic in the reality grasped by the theory that makes theorizing inherently impossible. Nagel rightly points out that on closer inspection, any view about the cosmos as a whole will implicitly or explicitly draw on speculative assumptions. If this is the case, we are at the very least entitled to assume that the cosmos is not necessarily incompatible with our search for understanding and explanation. A weak version of the anthropic principle holds that the fact that there are scientific observers such as us tells us that the cosmos is not in principle inaccessible to thought. For thought has arisen from the cosmos itself and has managed to adapt to its laws. Any picture of human-mindedness in which it is governed by laws in principle unintelligible from within human-mindedness or reason will smack of unjustified skepticism. However, after a convincing defence of the reality of reason and its irreducibility to principles external to reason, such as those discovered by evolutionary biology, Nagel jumps to the conclusion that we need a new kind of futuristic science which respects the weak anthropic principle by assuming that there is tendency in the cosmos to produce intelligent life making sense of the cosmos. Nagel happily rejoices in the romantic notion that the cosmos gradually awakens via the evolution of intelligent life until it sees itself in the mirror of human scientific practices and figures out its own existence and the place of consciousness in the world as whole. Nagel's romantic musings only make sense against the backdrop of the common assumption that any conception of the human mind must be able to integrate mental phenomena in their entirety into the natural order. Speculative metaphysics, be it of Chalmers' quantum mechanical or Nagel's naturphilosophical variety, is a side effect of a conception of mind that actually views mind as something which cannot belong to the natural order as it is understood by the materialist. By trying to fit the mind into the natural order as originally conceived by the materialist, they are granting the materialist the rules of the game, which they try to change as they play along. This incoherent sleight of hand, however, will not convince the materialist. Rather, it entitles her to postulate that if the choice is between a fully materialistic worldview and a materialistic worldview with a magical or speculative appendix, there must be a respectable materialist theory of the mind after all. Geist as an explanatory structure. When I gave the talk that turned into this book chapter, the majority of the audience were awake. Many were actually following my argument, trying to locate gaps and other shortcomings, or attempting to figure out where I was leading them before they made up their minds about the acceptability of my claims. Every person in the room was feeling a certain way. Also, every person in the room believed that more than 300,000 Chinese households own more than one pair of shoes. Everybody who was awake during my lecture or daydreaming either heard my voice or saw my gestures, whether attentively or consciously, or at least to such an extent that each could direct the spotlight of their attention to the phenomena I was pointing out. This is a very rough sketch of my explanation of how it is possible that a philosophical lecture was taking place at that moment in the past when I was the speaker. In addition to the aforementioned facts, there are evidently further socio-historical conditions for this event, such as the fact that belly dancing is not to be expected from the average philosopher during his talk. In the contemporary scientific climate, outrageously artistic performances, such as reading aphorisms instead of presenting thoughts in a more explicitly linear way, are also no longer to be expected from philosophers. What I have just depicted is an explanation from the intentional stance, to borrow Dennett's famous term. I am giving an account of what was happening that does not mention the information processing in brains, the transformation of acoustic waves into bits of information which travel in brains through various channels. Nor did I mention gravity or any laws of nature, which are further necessary conditions for events such as philosophy lectures as we know them. We can now draw a preliminary distinction between mind and nature that will put us on the right track towards locating the gap that separates mind and nature without succumbing to the naturalistic pressure of locating that gap within nature. When we account for a natural kind, such as a particular hydrophobic molecule, we are warranted in believing that the natural kind might be utterly different from any specific characterization or description attached to the use of the term designed to pick it out in ordinary language. If a poet describes water pearls on the surface of a lush meadow, he is not thereby necessarily thinking of the hydrophobic properties that explain why it looks to human and other animal observers as if there were little pearls running down a surface. The phenomenon, little pearls on a surface, is very well, if not actually best, explained in terms of a natural interaction between various natural kinds. This is reflected in the notion that natural kind terms have a potentially hidden semantic element, that is, a meaning not necessarily transparent in a competent usage of the relevant terms by ordinary speakers. The poet is not making a mistake when he describes a phenomenon. He's just not getting at the essence of the natural kind. In the poetical context, this does not constitute any sort of failure, just as the absence of poetic language in a scientific paper is rightly not perceived as a mistake. In the case of the mind, many have pointed out that the appearance-reality distinction, the distinction between a competent surface use of a term and its essential reference, which might be hidden to the ordinary speaker, breaks down at some point. Even self-confessed materialists such as Dennett present their own version of the breakdown of the appearance-reality distinction for consciousness. On some level or another, in the case of consciousness, the appearance is the reality. I propose to locate the semantic action not in a natural gap between inanimate and animate matter of a certain complexity, but between natural kinds and Geist as an explanatory structure. To distance my account from the anti-materialist stances in standard philosophy of mind, I use the word Geist to designate the phenomena I want to characterize and to get in touch with a venerable tradition of thinking of ourselves as intelligent agents. English does not have an exact equivalent of Geist, as neither mind nor spirit will really do, which is why I will stick to the German word and ask the reader to see it as a piece of technical vocabulary. The relevant distinction between natural kinds and Geist becomes transparent if we distinguish the following two cases of error. Imagine that I have a false belief about some natural kind. Maybe I confuse gauge and scalar bosons, since I do not really know how exactly these two types of bosons differ from each other. This does not change their essence. Gauge and scalar bosons have their individuating properties regardless of my false beliefs about them. Now imagine that I erroneously believe myself to be a leading squash player. I might have played squash with a couple of friends and observed that we were constantly getting better at the game, so I decided I will win the world championship. As I lose every single match in the tournament, I cling to my erroneous self-conception as a major squash player and explain the events as mere luck on the side of my opponent. Maybe because of some psychological feature in myself, my erroneous belief that I am a brilliant squash player evolves into a full-blown self-delusion and determines a good deal of my life. My error about the bosons does not change the bosons, yet my self-delusion changes me. And in many cases, self-delusion can change people to such an extent that we hardly recognize them. As a matter of fact, We build our entire lives on various forms of biased self-representation, as we all experience ourselves as centres of interest and find a location for everything we perceive or think about in various, often narratively mediated accounts of who we are. It is in fact impossible to account for human behaviour as we know it without the dimension of our various capacities to engage in fictional storytelling. The entire socio-historical and political realm is built on our fictional capacities, which have been placed centre stage in the tradition of a philosophy of Geist originating in the 18th century with Kant's dream of a spirit seer. The idea in this tradition, which included Hegel, Marx and Nietzsche, and continues in a materialist disguise in philosophers such as Dennett, is that Geist is precisely not a natural kind, because our relation to the phenomena we subsume under our mentalistic vocabulary differs significantly from our relation to natural phenomena. Remarkably, Dennett draws a distinction between natural phenomena such as diseases and earthquakes and phenomena that depend on their concepts. Open quote, on the view of consciousness I will develop in this book, it turns out that consciousness, like love and money, is a phenomenon that does indeed depend to a surprising extent on its associated concepts. Close quote. That's from Dennett, 1991. Unfortunately, Dennett does not clarify to what extent consciousness depends on its associated concepts and how that differs from love and money. And even if it is the case that elements of our mentalistic vocabulary are such that they are phenomena that depend on their concepts, we should not talk about consciousness here, since the umbrella term consciousness has uses where it actually picks out a natural kind, such as an animal's state of being awake, or of having vivid hallucinatory dreams. In order to have room for a naturalization of some aspect of our self-descriptions, I want to reserve the word Geist for the features of human mindedness that really are phenomena that depend on their concepts, as Dennett puts it in an unwitting Hegelian moment. For Hegel's entire philosophy of Geist can be summed up in the slogan that Geist is the domain of phenomena that depend on their concepts. The point is that Geist is not a natural kind or complicated structure of natural kinds, but precisely something that does not even exist independently of the specific descriptions used in order to point out Geisting phenomena. Without your belief that this is a philosophy paper, that I consciously wrote down these words intended to communicate with you, that I have read works by Dennett, and that I know that there are books and objections, there would be no philosophy paper. The very existence of philosophy is clearly tied to Geist. Philosophy is Geisting. Philosophy is Geistig. Notice that Dennett unfortunately introduces the category of what I call Geist only in order to head for its extinction. From Dennett, the post-conscious period of human conceptualization. His brand of an eliminativist materialism, however, once again, only makes sense against the backdrop of a materialist conception of the natural order, together with the assumption that human mindedness as we know it can only be integrated into the natural order or eliminated from the ontological realm of things which exist. Open quote, the idea of mind as distinct in this way from the brain, composed not of ordinary matter but of some other special kind of stuff, is dualism, and it is deservedly in disrepute today. End of quote. Sure, if Geist was some kind of extraordinary matter, it would deserve to be in disrepute today and should have been in disrepute at least since the dawn of philosophy. But my warranted assumptions that you are awake, that the University of Bonn is an institution financially supported by the German taxpayer, etc., are not even candidates for things composed of any kind of matter, be it regular or special kind of stuff. The institution of taxes does not belong to the natural order, and we usually do not look for its integration into the natural order before we have convinced ourselves that materialism is the right kind of metaphysics and that we can only do justice to its conceptual pressures if we either eliminate or integrate into the natural order any phenomenon that does not wear its material energetic nature on its sleeve. It is essential to the concept of the natural order, as the term the natural order is used, that it is the order consisting of natural kinds. Natural kinds, in turn, are the kinds of things that would have been the way they are had no one ever evolved to figure out the way they are. Let us call any fact that would have obtained had no one ever evolved to figure it out a maximally modally robust fact. The notion of scientific objectivity from the third-person point of view is the notion of a position from which we are able to tell maximally modally robust facts from facts with a lesser degree of modal robustness. Precisely because we have at our disposal the concept of maximally modally robust facts, the very obtaining of different kinds of facts raises the question of whether and how these other kinds of facts might fit into the natural order. How can something that for its very existence depends on being thought of, conceived of, or experienced from a subjective point of view be part of the natural order? The answer to this question, I suggest, is this: facts whose obtaining depends on our concepts of them, facts whose obtaining depends on our concepts of them as such, just are not part of the natural order. However, this does not rule out that there are some relevant connections between the different kinds of facts whose obtaining we need to recognise. Yet the relevant connections will not have any of the standard forms discussed in the philosophy of mind. Let me elaborate. The question of how mind and brain are related to each other is utterly ill-framed. For one thing, the concept of mind, even more than the concept of consciousness, is a mongrel concept. It is used in indefinitely many senses, and its meaning varies grossly, both synchronically and diachronically, but also according to people's beliefs about their own mindedness. This is not surprising, because mind and consciousness, as well as the affiliated family of mentalistic terms such as thinking, cognition, will, emotion, affect, self-consciousness, and awareness, are introduced in large-scale explanatory contexts. For all we know, from the pictorial documents of our prehistorical ancestors, human beings, insofar as we can know anything about what they were up to, have been making sense of their actions in the largest possible context of the world as a whole for a very long time. The prehistorical record is subject to wild mythological speculation. It is hard enough to make sense of the mentalistic self-portrait of Homer or the various Vedanta texts, let alone of cave paintings, which, for all we will ever know, might have served pretty much any function, from forms of religious veneration to hunting manuals. The constant of mentalistic variation is the fact that human beings are trying to make sense of their actions within a larger context, typically within the largest possible context they can imagine, the world as a whole, or what they believe the world as a whole to be. The notion that mind has to fit into the natural order is nothing but the most recent mythology, the most recent attempt to fit all phenomena that are relevant to human action explanation into an all-encompassing structure. What has changed over the course of the modern development of our self-conception is the background worldview, and not for the better. Materialism or naturalism assumes that the world as a whole is identical with the universe or nature, and that actually to exist is to be part of the world as a whole understood as nature. But this move unnecessarily glosses over the fact that the natural order in this context is invoked as an element of action explanation. You cannot eliminate the element of action explanation from a worldview designed to figure out how action fits into the world, as this just undermines the explanandum. The point about the explanandum is that it is essentially a moving target because of its constitutive concept dependence. What we do is tied to how we conceive of it. Human action, as we as historically situated agents know it, is always integrated into non-natural contexts governed by institutions. There is no point in trying to clean out the semantic mess of our mentalistic vocabulary by providing a referent from the natural order for every single mentalistic term or otherwise eliminating the term from language. The result would not be an enlightened community of scientifically minded thinkers, but a society without institutions and history. Geist is an explanatory structure invoked in the context of action explanation. Some of the things human agents do can be accounted for only with adequate reference to the fact that they do them in light of an historically variable conception of what it is for them to be human. Humans live their lives in light of a conception of what the human being is. This conception does not pick out a natural kind. One argument for this draws on the category distinction between different kinds of mistake. To be wrong about a natural kind, say fermions, does not change it. The spin of fermions is the way it is anyhow, regardless of our knowledge or error. However, if we are wrong about ourselves as agents and believe mistakenly that the human being is identical to a certain animal species to which we humans belong, this immediately changes our status as agents. Biological naturalism, in the sense of an all-out identification of human being and human animal, challenges our value system by suggesting a revision of our moral practices in light of its own norm. Its fundamental norm derives from the claim that to be human is to play a certain role in the animal kingdom, in the earth zoo. This is an intrusion into the sphere of Geist and not a successful elimination yet. Neo-existentialism and the conditional model of mind and brain. A proper subset of our mentalistic vocabulary comprises elements that do not refer to natural kinds. This does not rule out a priori that there is another proper subset of the same vocabulary that happens to pick out natural kinds. The state of being awake or various urges we consciously experience belong to this category. As things stand, our mentalistic vocabulary is differentiated both diachronically and synchronically over different natural languages and specialized idiolects. It is not unified in any specific way beyond the fact that we typically invoke it in contexts where what matters is action explanation, including activities such as predicting or regulating future behavior. What is also important here is that our mentalistic vocabulary is not unified by constituting the body of a theory such as folk psychology. Folk psychology is a misguided positive theories about the human mind driven by the metaphysics of naturalism. The mentalistic vocabulary inherited from the history of literature, religion, philosophy, science, law, practices of confession, politics, etc., has only a formal core. There is no unified folk psychology that characterizes human-mindedness across all speakers and cultures. Neo-existentialism identifies this formal core as the activity of making sense of the human being by giving an account of which faculties and conceptual capacities distinguish it both from utterly non-organic anonymous processes and from organic, non-human life. This formal core distinguishes us from all other life forms insofar as we know and understand them. The existentialist tradition contains thinkers such as Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and Sartre. What they all have in common as a minimal assumption is the belief that Geist, the specifically human mind, brings with it a capacity to create institutions in light of our socially mediated map of how our actions and their explanations fit into a larger context. The human being transcends its position in any given situation and constantly integrates it into a larger cartography of how things hang together. We live our lives under the assumption that other people live their lives under different assumptions. This is why we are essentially interested in how our fellow human beings view us and reality. Unfortunately, the existentialist tradition does not usually explicitly address the issues correlated with the mind-brain problem, but rather offers strategies for avoiding it in justified ways. Neo-existentialism attempts to address the issue head-on, while at the same time deflating it. It argues for an anti-materialist position, as it denies that the largest possible frame in which phenomena are supposed to take place is identical to the natural order. Neo-existentialism argues that it is a misguided project to identify phenomena that essentially depend on our conceptualizations of them, with phenomena unified by being phenotypes of natural kinds parsed in the terms of natural science. We should not expect that all phenomena which have been described from the intentional stance over the millennia, and for which we have some kind of record of documenting an inner life, could possibly be theoretically unified by finding an equivalent natural substratum for them. Yet this is arguably exactly the driving idea behind the ideology that in a recent polemic book I dubbed neurocentrism. Following the British geriatric physician Raymond Tallis, I claim there that neurocentrism, what he calls neuromythology, has two axes: neuromania and Darwinitis. Neuromania, as I understand it, is the attempt to identify the brain, or rather its neural circuits, as the natural kinds corresponding to a purified mentalistic vocabulary. Darwinitis is the associated attempt to explain all human behaviour in terms of evolutionary biology or psychology. The concepts of cultural evolution and of memes belong to this category of mistake, since they suggest that history can be accounted for in the theoretical terms of actual evolutionary theory. While this makes for nice party jokes, I do not think that it actually leads anywhere towards explaining human mating behaviour in terms of the unconscious intention hardwired in our organisms to spread our genes, of whose existence we have become aware rather recently. As a matter of fact, integrating terms and material inferences that are valid in evolutionary theory into our mentalistic vocabulary can have the side effect of changing us on the level of Geist. This is because it invites the false belief that some terminological elements that essentially do not pick out natural kinds refer to natural kinds. This is not an innocent mistake or cognitive error, for erroneous beliefs about the human mind change the status of the agent, just like a clumsy squash player's delusions of being a world-class squash player turns him into a self-deluded squash player. There is a substantial difference between the fact that someone is not a good squash player and the fact that he erroneously believes himself to be one, a difference that can become the source of pathological behaviour. Roger Scruton makes a similar point with respect to what he calls biological reductionism. Open quote, "Our states of mind have intentionality and therefore depend upon the ways in which we conceptualize the world. Furthermore, we cannot assume that our emotions will remain unaffected when we learn to conceptualize their objects in some new and allegedly scientific way. Just as indignation at a villain is undermined by the description of him or her as an automaton, obedient to impulses in the central nervous system, so does erotic love retreat when its object is described in the pseudo-scientific jargon of sexology. End of quote. The notion that human beings, qua members of the animal realm, are fundamentally or essentially biological machines whose goals are just the goals of any life form we know of, is a wild overgeneralization on the basis of poor data. It only looks plausible if we ignore our historical and sociologically mediated knowledge of the actual indefinitely large variety of human self-conceptions. Human beings essentially depend on their self-conceptions, for they act in light of who they take themselves to be. Someone might wonder whether neo-existentialism is not a metaphysically extravagant view, maybe even an unwilling air of Cartesian dualism, a creeping suspicion which typically kicks in if a philosopher opposes naturalism. In order to get a sense of why my view should not provoke this reaction, think of the relation between a bicycle and the activity of cycling. This relation offers a toy model of the ontology of neo-existentialism. Bicycles are clearly necessary and material conditions for cycling. No one could cycle without a bicycle, unless of course they had a tricycle. Now, this is hardly a profound metaphysical insight, or so I hope. Also, the physical features of the bicycle determine a range of cycling behaviours. No one could win the Tour de France with the bicycle I use to ride to my office. Yet the relation between a bicycle and the range of cycling behaviours cannot be modelled along the lines of traditional concepts governing our understanding of the mind-brain relation. Bicycles do not cause cycling. They are not identical to cycling. Cycling cannot be theoretically or ontologically reduced to bicycles. Certainly, cycling cannot be eliminated by claiming that there really are only bicycles. At most, cycling supervenes on bicycles, where this just means that no cycling can take place without events materially realised at the level of bicycles. But this is not very informative, as it merely repeats the claim that bicycles are necessary conditions for cycling. My claim is that the relation between mind and brain, in all the cases which really motivate the question of how something mental fits into the natural order, is like the relation between cycling and bicycles. The relevant tertium comparationis is a conditional model. The relation between mind and brain, just like that between cycling and bicycles, boils down to an arrangement of necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. There are necessary conditions for the warranted application of mentalistic terms, from talking about mere vigilance and non-conscious sensory registration to geistig activities, such as arguing for neo-existentialism, thinking about the implications of monotheism for political theology, interpreting Pina Bausch's Aryan, running for president, and so on. Nothing that can possibly take place within the range of my organism, let alone in my brain or nervous system, could ever be sufficient for any of these activities. In fact, not even adult conscious perception falls into the category of natural kinds, given its essential relation to external objects and our conceptualization of them. This does not mean that the relation between the various conditions into which we can analyse a full-blown mental situation is somehow causal. Causation only makes sense on some levels of that analysis. It does not run through all levels. Conditions for certain activities, such as exercising one's conceptual activities acquired to judge aptly that a certain wine counts as modern, or a smoky Washington Pinot Noir include a variety of factors involving natural kinds such as taste buds and a healthy organism. But this does not mean that my taste buds trigger the judgment that the wine I am tasting is a smoky Washington Pinot Noir. My taste buds stand in various causal relations, including relations with pretty much the observable universe as a whole, but this does not make it the case that their role as conditions in a network of conditions turns them into causal agents within the hierarchy of conditions. Neo-existentialism recommends a conditional model of mind and brain. It claims that the relationship between mind and brain is actually a relationship between conditions that we can bring to the fore only on the basis of an analysis of a given situation into its necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. This involves commitment to an indispensability thesis. Our access to natural kinds works via a situation in which action-explanation matters, and any such situation relies on Geist as an indispensable and irreducible feature. This does not at all imply that we cannot access non-mental reality as it is in itself. Yet it is the case that we cannot have access to both non-mental reality as it is in itself and our access conditions to it without at some point referring to real elements and processes that simply do not fall into the category of natural kinds. To know that something is the case in non-mental reality differs categorically from knowing something about this very knowledge. There are different forms of knowledge with different kinds of objectivity springing from them. To be sure, there is a general form of objectivity present everywhere where we can, in principle, distinguish between taking something to be true and its being true. However, our concepts divide into subdomains that ideally latch onto the senses that constitute a field of sense. Different forms of knowledge require different objectivity conditions, a rule book, specified by the senses, concepts attached to a given field of sense. Having a suitable brain is a necessary condition for participating in the explanatory structure of Geist. There are no immaterial souls, if this means that there are agents which interfere with the causal order studied by the natural sciences without leaving a material energetic trace. There is no chance that I will survive my own death in any interesting sense of the term. Only some properties of me will survive my own death, such as someone's memory of me or a YouTube clip of a talk of mine. But, as Woody Allen has pithily remarked, I would rather be immortal in my apartment than in the memory of my descendants. Yet the fact of a brain, or rather an entire organism, which is an instance of a species that is a link in a complicated evolutionary chain, is a necessary condition for my participation in the explanatory, historically open structure of Geist, does not motivate the notion that Geist could find a place in the natural order. It is simply misguided to try to fit all phenomena into a single framework that is supposed to settle questions of existence or reality for that matter. Many things are real, but this does not entail that there is a single thing, reality, of which all real things are proper parts.